All right, so here we are in part 4 of the logo project, or the logo forming project, and in this part we're going to look at all sorts of different things. We're going to add a few sort of elements to our scene. They're going to be sort of finishing touches for rendering, and we're going to also move into the materials and lighting and all that kind of cool stuff. But first, let's take a look at the scene that we have, and if we need to make any tweaks, let's do that. And one thing I'm noticing now that I've sort of had a look at this a bit more, is that I'm finding that the nebula, whilst it is a spiral at this point, it kind of needs to be a little more defined as a spiral. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to increase the strength of a couple of these things. So I'm going to increase the strength of our 2 spline, and let's put that at 10%. This will get it a little bit closer to where we were in my prototyping. And it's really evident to me now, having looked at this quite a few times, that it needs to have this shaping to really feel sort of more accurate. So I'm actually going to recache this. It takes a couple of minutes, remember. I won't make you watch that. I'm just going to hit the build button, overwrite, let it run the cache. Oh, actually, before I do that, I've just realized that I had my color driver off. And in fact, we need to set that color driver back up again. So don't forget that. Remember, we just turn off, we turned off the inherit there, and I've turned on the color. Jump to the modifiers tab here, and we can just exclude the inherit, even though it's off, that's fine. Clear the initial state, and let's make sure that we're not playing a loop. Press play, and this will play, hopefully, if I show it there. There we go. Got loads of particles in this scene. So it's just going to play through the timeline, get to the end. We're going to set initial for the color, stamping the color. We probably could have got away with what I was doing before, but with this method, it kind of forms this nice shape beforehand. I'm just going to pause and jump into the other camera. There we go. Press play and carry on. It's fine to do that as long as you don't scrub back and forwards in the same time. Okay, and can you see now it's kind of spreading out? Can you see that? We're getting these way more defined spirals because we're kind of attracting more to and away from the, and along, I should say, from the particles. Okay, let's just let it play to the final frame here. There we go, and then set initial. So set that state, and let's just go to the modifiers tab, include. And then we're including nothing, of course. So let's just double check that. So if I go back and press play, it's already set up. It's no problem. Okay, and you can see the performance is much better because it's not having to actually simulate these particles. They're just being emitted in their positions with their colors, and that's it. So let's hide that. Turn our emitter back on and our cache back on. And this time, with the inherit and the color swapped around. So inherit on, color off. Empty that cache, hit build, and this time we're going to overwrite. Let that cache take a couple of minutes, and we'll be back. All right, so that's cached, and let's check out that. It's very consistent. If you look, it's exactly the same time it took. And let's jump into the camera. Oh, there we go. Much better shaping. And we could tweak the. We could always jump into the advanced tab and tweak the seed. If you want a different look each time, you can grab a different seed and recache, but I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. Let's scrub a little bit further forward. There we go. And it comes in nicely there. Awesome. So I'm pretty happy with that now. And I think we're going to look at adding a few more elements later on. But first, let's get the basics in. Let's render the streams first, and then we'll have a look at the nebula as well. So first of all, I'm just going to turn off the implosion. And let's get down to our trail object here. So let's also jump into our cycles layout because we're actually going to start rendering. I'm just going to check my GPUs. Yeah, so it's not using the monitor one. And what I can do is in the material manager, I can add a material for our trail object. I'm just going to add first of all, an object material. And we'll tweak the settings of this in a second, but I'm just going to attach that, assign it to our trail object. Now, if I hit render or run the RTP, play in the RTP, I actually can't see anything because there are no lights in the scene. If I dropped in, say, a few lights, I could just drop a cycles light in. You start to get a hint of it. You can kind of see it there. If I move down to this point, you can see them. There we go. So let's actually change the camera to the default camera. And let's just zoom into these trails, and you can see there they are. They have a thickness to them, and they also need light. And what we're going to do is we're going to make these metallic, so they're just going to catch some lights. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually have some lights rotating around this, like sort of around, motivating that spiral effect a bit more. So I can use lights like this, but I don't really need them to be lights at this point. I only need them to be able to reflect onto the surface. So we could actually just use a couple of large planes or large polys. So let's add those to our scene. And well, depending on how massive we want them, we don't want them to be too huge, but let's see what's the default. 400 is actually not too bad. Well, first of all, let's call this reflection plane. It's a bit like a softbox, but it's just going to be a material-based one. So let's add an emissive material. So we go to surface and then emission. We drop that on our reflection plane, and you can see immediately that is already lighting our scene. Because cycles is a path tracer, so any emissive objects will transfer rays across the scene. And then we can just duplicate that one. Don't even need to rotate it actually, because it's going to be... Let's move that one to the other side here. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to rotate them. But let's call this... rotating lights. We'll call this one 02 and this one 01. There we go. And having put them in this null that's centered here, actually probably should center it on 0. It's just, yeah, that's fine. And we want to rotate it around essentially. Something like that. Or the other way around maybe. We'll have a play around once things are more in position. I also probably want to pump the brightness of these right now because they're kind of low. And maybe give them a different brightness per light. So let's jump into here. Let's pump that brightness right up. Just bring it a touch back down again. Somewhere like there. And then let's because we're setting these lights up and they're the only thing they're going to be reflecting in the scene is these splines. So we need to really get that material a little bit closer to how it's going to look. So as you can also see is that our lights are visible in the scene. We can actually hide them from the scene. If we just right click and add a cycles tag and we hit object and then we just change it to be invisible. So they're now no longer visible from the camera. You could also stop them from casting shadows, that kind of stuff. That's less necessary because there's nothing to cast a shadow. But yeah, you've got all that control here. So I should also put these on my lighting layer. So if I hold Control or Command down whilst I add it to the layer, it's going to add all the tags, everything to that layer, which makes it easy to solo that stuff out and deactivate it when we want to. Okay, so we've got some light planes in the scene. We're definitely going to be messing around a bit more with the orientation there. There's a bit, they don't seem quite right location-wise. But, like I said, let's just develop our material for our trail object here. So, let's make it a metallic material. And to do that, you just simply, you crank up the metallic value on this principled node. This is like a really easy way to kind of develop materials quickly. And we can keep it pretty damn simple. We just have to set the base color here. Ooh, set the base color and just clicked it out and clicked away to something kind of a warmy kind of gold color. Somewhere like that maybe. And then nice and bright, like so. There we go. So it's kind of this, well, it's somewhere in gold, somewhere maybe bronze. Yeah, let's call it bronze. So I like to put a CY in front of my cycles materials just to help discern them quickly. So bronze streams, or you could say trails. Actually, trails is probably a bit more specific to XP. So bronze trails, there we go. And then right now we don't have any kind of roughness stuff, so increase the roughness somewhat. You see that softens it all the way along the trail a bit nicer there. All right, so let's just scrub to a few different places. We're probably going to play with the thickness of these as well. We might animate it down because they're quite thick towards the end, but they're actually quite nice when they're at this value at the beginning here. So yeah, let's actually set the trail thickness. So what we can do is, because we've already cached this data and we haven't stored any of the thickness data on this trail, what we do is we add a cycles curve tag, a CY curve tag. There we go. And this actually gives us post control over the thickness of our trail. And you can see here we've got these options to have it different thicknesses at the end and at the start and that kind of stuff. We just want to have it pretty much set up so that we can have it's a sort of maybe animate it down, or let's have a check actually. So 0.5, 0.5 maybe. You can have different thicknesses at the end and at the start. I don't think we want that. I think we just want quite a simple... Actually, they can trail... Yeah, maybe they do trail off at the back. Yeah. So that's looking pretty interesting. Let's rotate our lights and see what we get. Different looks. We're definitely going to play around with those a bit in a bit. Maybe animate them, like I said. So, okay, let's start. I think if we start them quite thick and then they kind of animate down, 0.5 actually looks quite nice back up here, just as long as we can see these nice trails. And they'll also reflect the particles and stuff, so hopefully that'll kind of boost them as well. The brightness of the... It's kind of a bit of a cool light at the moment, so I might want to warm up the color of that reflection as well. So now we could do that in the material, but the actual light warming up will also look quite cool. We could just use a temperature node for that, or a black body temperature. So black body, essentially it's taking the black body radiation curve or gradient that you get in real life based on temperature, and it converts it to a color value that we can utilize in cycles. But I want it to be kind of somewhere kind of fairly warm. Let's connect it up to our emission. Let's see. That's too warm. I think about there is probably quite nice. If we go too warm, it's going to look a bit weird, but you can see how much that has given us. It looks much nicer. We could even tweak that per light, but I don't think we need to. I'll mess around with that in a minute, probably when it's in context with the implosion. Okay, so like I said, the thickness of the trails is quite large in here, so I might want to scale these down a little bit. Kind of create not a fade as such, but more of a kind of a scale down to their sort of final values, just in the tag actually. So I think the particle size was 0.3, so if we made the thickness of these 0.3 as well. So let's add a few keyframes. So let's add a keyframe here, and then around about see, they're quite thick and dense here, so let's yeah, looks a bit better. Makes them a bit more delicate looking. So get these nice streams coming across the camera, which is cool. And there we go, forming up the logo. Now, one thing I'm noting is that we're not actually seeing a shape of the logo in splines. So what we can do is we can actually utilize the geometry that we already have. We don't need to do any simulation here. We can just extract a spline that represents our logo, and we can convert that, extract it from the geometry, and then we can drive that using something called an XP Spline Growth. And if I jump down to our logo, I'm just going to duplicate it for this purpose. It doesn't need to be the nice subdivided one. In fact, it can be this sort of unsubdivided one. I'm just going to pause the render. We're in our default camera, so that's fine. Let's zoom in. And what I want to do is I want to extract just the edges. So I could go around and I could select all these individual edges. It'll take us a while. But there's actually a tool that's really well designed in Cinema 4D for exactly this purpose. So if I actually change the color of that to something like, well, let's just default color. There we go. There's actually a tool for selecting stuff like this. And if we go to the select menu, and you see this Phong break selection, and if I select it, and you can see now I've got these set up as like a default, but by default this is probably just deactivated like that. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to select Phong breaks and Phong selections, which actually can grab our edges. Now you can see we've got some Phong breaks here where I've beveled the edges and stuff, but I don't want that. I actually want to override that. I want to uncheck the edge breaks, and you can see when I uncheck those, the bevel tool creates edge breaks by default, so that's probably what that was doing. And then I can change the angle that this is going to grab. If I hit select all, you can see we've now got the edges of all of our, or most of our objects, and we can change this setting so we could actually have it in capture some more of these. And I could just go and manually and add some of these cross-bridging sort of sections here if they haven't been captured. You know, maybe add that one there, or that's absolutely fine. Drop that down. I'm holding shift when I'm clicking it there, so it adds to the selection. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. Now we need to convert this into a spline, so I'm going to hit my commander and I go edge to spline, and you can see it's the last command I used in Cinema because I use that a lot, so quite likely. And now I pull that back out there, and we can actually get rid of this topology, although I have created that useful selection. So what I might do is I might do set selection, and I might just drag that onto our geometry that's in this thing. Because it's the same geometry, it'll be the right selection. So if I delete that, just to prove the point, if I turn these off, double click that. Yeah, okay. Okay, so yeah, we've got that now stored if we ever need to come back and use that. Let's turn this back on, hide it. Jump to our spline. So this is our cool looking spline, and you can see if I simply throw the same materials on as if I jump in here, if I just throw this, I should probably get rid of the keyframe off that actually, just to make it nice and thick. And the same material, jump to our main shot camera and press play. Oh, I need to make sure it's rendering. We actually get our logo displaying. Now the problem is that how are we going to animate this on? You can see in combination with these trails, it's going to look like it's being formed by them. But to do that, we actually need to animate it on. And we could use a few different methods here. But there's a new kind of cool other object in X-Particles called XP Spline Growth. Now this can be seen as like a spline deformer. And you actually make it a child of a spline that you want to animate. Let's jump to our default camera and zoom right in. And what we can do is we can actually animate this. If we go to the object tab, we can actually animate this length from 0 to 1. And you can see there, in fact, if I make the viewport color a bit more obvious. There we go. Object. You can see as I scrub, it animates on our spline. And this has some benefits over some of the other tools in Cinema in that it's kind of geared up for X-Particles trails and that kind of thing. So let's add some keyframes, and I think it's going to have to start animating up as the splines hit the surface. So let's add a keyframe at 0% here. And then let's move on another sort of 200 frames. And it's fully animated on. So we're about halfway point. There we go, starting to build. Going the wrong way. There we go, build until it's done. Awesome. And obviously this is going to be combined with other stuff. So it's not just going to be this outline. This is sort of going to be a part of the framework. Let's jump to our main camera. And it's starting to take shape. Okay, we've got these two stragglers that kind of come in. I think that's going to be fine, especially with all the particles that we're going to have around. Okay, so this is I'd say that's pretty much our trails are set up. Like I said, once we've got the implosion in, I'm going to work on rotating the light to kind of give it a bit more of a dynamic feel to the environment. But for now, I'm pretty happy with the trails, and we're going to move on to the implosion. So let's reactivate our implosion. And it brings our particles back on, but we don't see any. It needs to be rendering. There we go. I stopped it. What we can do is we can actually add a tag to this. Well, there's two options actually. We can add a material or we can add a tag. Now I'm going to need the tag eventually to control some sort of scale stuff and the sort of the shape that we're going to use and some randomization things. But I could just start with a material. Now I know that I'm going to need a material. There's a bunch of presets here, and you can see the cycles menu in the create submenu of the material manager. Gives us a few presets and a few advanced presets and that kind of thing. Now the one that I want to utilize is I actually want to utilize the speed. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have them, as it slows down to 0 to make contact with the surface, it's going to actually change color with a gradient. Let's go back to that menu. So X-Particles. So I'm actually going to use one of these presets to start with, and then we're going to kind of dissect it, utilize some of it, and it'll be a lot more complex by the end, but step by step it should make sense. So I'm going to add a speed by speed material, and you can see we've got this here. And if I just assign that to our main implosion, you'll see we actually see our particles. And this is actually not far away from the gradient I'm actually looking for. Well, I'll explain. So if I jump to a side camera, we can see the color here is this blue color here and then orange here. Now you can see the ramp that we have are those two colors. Oh, let's turn off our streams whilst we're here. There we go. And we could even turn off our, or at least hide our topo spline. There we go. Okay, so back to explaining what this is about. Now, if I just move these, kind of space them out a little bit more comfortably, you can see here we've got this particle info node, and this is basically bringing in the particle data from whatever this material is assigned to. So it could be any emitter in the scene, it could be any other object, as long as it has particles. It could be an XP group, for example. And if I right-click that and I do unhide unused sockets, we get exposed all of the data that we can actually access to, like, amongst these particles. There's even stuff that it can also generate data, so it can actually create random assignments of 0 to 1 values. And you can see if I zoom in, we get that. Now that's useful if we wanted to randomize the color, but I don't want to randomize the color. I actually want to utilize some of the data we already have. And what we're doing is we're passing velocity. Now velocity is a vector, and with a vector, it gives us two things. It gives us the direction of the particle, but also the speed. And the speed is actually the magnitude of that vector. It's the length of that vector. Now we don't need to worry too much about the detail there. All it does is it gives us the speed out of our vector. So instead of like a vector, which would be an X, Y, and Z value, this is actually going to give us a speed value out of those. And it just a 0 to whatever the maximum speed is. Right, so we've got that. And what we can see here is it's set default to 0 to 300. So we know that the blue particles are either 0 or less. I doubt they're less because they're frozen. And then the orange is the higher value. So I could actually change this gradient to make it a bit more clear. and I'll use a multicolored gradient. So I'll use heat. This is quite a good diagnostic gradient because you can really see which is the start and which is the end of this ramp. So you can see now we've got a bit more of a definition in the color here. And you can see the red here is 300 and over. So any particle that's 300 and over will be included in that speed. And then blue is pretty much getting close to zero static. And then right in the middle there, just multiply it by 50%, of course, because that's the position on this ramp. Oops, I nudged it. So the not position, you can multiply that 50% on this 300 value, and that'll be 150 units per second, sorry. Okay, so let's zoom out, and you can see it kind of gives you this interesting look. Now this is what we're going to want at the end, but I am going to want it, and in fact, actually, just to prove the point, if I go back to the beginning, you can see the particles are slower at the beginning, and they're almost frozen, so they're almost all at zero speed, and then as they accelerate, they get added into this blue, and they go through the different phases. But the key part is I want to focus on the last part here because we're going to have a different color at the beginning blending into this one. So currently it's set to 300 units. I'm just going to have it a little further back than that. So let's say 400 units. There we go. So it's a bit of a softer gradient in that way. And I've actually got some colors that we've already sort of worked out. We've got these two, I've cheated a bit, and I've got these two saved gradients. Now you can access these in the file, and it's kind of got this kind of greens and blues, and we're transitioning from these kind of more warm colors to these nice cool colors, and these are going to complement our gold. If I turn those back on, you can see those complement that gold and bronze quite nicely. Okay, so let's just turn that back off. So you can see that we can use particle data and we can extract it and manipulate it and remap it using the color ramps. This is a really powerful workflow because we're not having to recache the particles, we're not having to give them any more color data, anything like that. But we can just utilize it to drive different sort of parts of our node graph here. Okay, so the next part I want to do is I want to create the base color for the nebula at the very beginning. So if I zoom out, in fact, let's go into the camera. Let's go into the main shot camera. This coloring will look better from that angle as well. There we go. We're also going to probably make this additive so that these particles add over each other. In fact, I'll just demonstrate how that works. So if I move this over here and I add an add shader, and I just drag it in between there and it'll auto connect, which is very handy. And I add a transparent Bsdf, then I connect that up. What's going to happen now is that we're going to get an add operation. So essentially the particles will allow themselves to be added on in value in depth, essentially. So you can see now we get this much hotter kind of areas in here and all that kind of cool stuff. So let's go right back to the beginning, like the first frame where we see the particles, and you can see at the moment they're all static, and that's the sort of because of the speed they're going zero speed. Now if I solo out their color, the color data, we get this gray or white to black kind of color, and it's from our actual particles. So this is the color that we stamped into those particles. And what we're going to do is we're actually just going to directly ramp this color because it's already 0 to 1. So I'm just going to grab a ramp, color ramp, and let's change it to our diagnostic gradient. I like to do this at the beginning just to kind of be able to see where I'm ramping and where I could kind of change the range and stuff like that. So let me connect this. Well, actually I can just solo this channel here. And there you go. Now we're actually seeing the noise represented. And what we could do is we could... in R20 and beyond, we get this nice ability to sort of squash the gradient, that kind of stuff. So we can see some of those blues coming through here, and then I could squash it this side. Or I could use a range mapper. I could actually change this data before it even gets here. So I could leave this gradient kind of wide like that, and then I could actually have another ramp. Oh, I need to make sure the color is outputting here, because if I solo the color, that's going to be our black and white gradient. Now what I can do is I can squish this gradient instead of squishing this one, which is a bit more complicated because it has more knots. I could squash this gradient and that will remap the input values of this ramp. So it's a sort of a nice, simple, dynamic way to keep that kind of animated. However, once again, I'm going to load in this gradient here. So it's kind of, let's solo that out just so we get a good look at it. Okay, so with that, we're going to do kind of a similar thing. We're going to feed it into an emission Bsdf. And we're actually going to mix it in with the... So I'm just going to shift all this up. I have grid snapping on, by the way. I always have that on. I much prefer it. Allows me to kind of organize this in a sort of a neat fashion, or neat as possible fashion. So we've got our color ramp. I might put it at a level with this one just because we know that that's kind of the same input level. I could just duplicate that emission Bsdf, emission shader. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them into a mix. So I'm just going to add a mix. Now this has to be a mix shader. Now the difference here, just as a little quick example. Oops, I've connected that. You have this mix RGB and you've got this mix shader. Now if you look at the color of the ports, the mix shader, well, for a start, the node is colored the same as the Bsdfs and the shaders. And the mix is colored the same as sort of all the color nodes. So this is dealing with color. So and it's expecting a color input. The yellow is a color input or output. Whereas the green is a shader, and that's the one we want here. So I can intercept this one here. We might be swapping these over. We might be swapping them over depending on the gradient. And then we connect that up there. And now we're mixing both of these gradients together. But we're only mixing it by a factor. So essentially it's like a slider from one to the other. So at factor 0, we're utilizing that speed. At factor 1, we're utilizing the color nebulous gradient. Right? So now that's the one that's pumping into our add shader. And what we'll do is we'll have that basically blend these two. We need something to drive this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use... There's a few different things I could do here actually, but I think I'm going to use the distance traveled value of the particles. Now, as I solo that out, you can see all of a sudden everything goes extremely bright, like over bright. And the reason for that is that the range of distance is quite a high value. So it's a 0 to several thousand perhaps, or it depends. But if I just pause our simulation, or sorry, pause our render, and I jump to our second view, and let's change it back to a top-down view. I zoom out, and we can see here we've got this our simulation going on, and I might just turn on our geometry just so we can see where it starts and ends. Oops. Yeah, there we go. So our geometry is in this plane here. Now, if I want to kind of check roughly the distance that's been traveled by these particles, and if you think we're thinking of this in reverse again, I draw a line from here to here, and I can do that. I can actually use the guide tool, and I use it. This is a little trick I like to use just to kind of measure stuff. So we've got a guide tool here, and I can just draw, so from one point to here, and we only need a rough value. I'm just kind of gauging a rough idea of how far that is. And if you look at the size, the Z length here, it's actually about 2,000 units. And I expect, I mean, really, they travel a bit further than that because they're kind of rotating as well. They're spiraling. So they're not taking a direct route. It's more likely they're going to be taking a spiraling route. So you could add a good 20% onto that, I should imagine, or 25%. So I'll turn that off. So say around about 2,400 units moved from this point to this point. And that's going to be important in a second. So let's jump into our main view. And let's actually go to the default camera and let's look at the side of our particles. Let's look from the side of our simulation. There we go. We could even do an orthogonal parallel camera here. So if I add a camera, like so, and I'm going to change it to parallel and just zoom out. That just means that I've flattened out. We're looking at this pretty much dead on side. Just take the angles off it. There we go. So our distance of 2,000 units or 2,400 units is what we're going to use to dictate this blend that we're going to create. So let's, first of all, let's grab a ramp, another ramp, of course. And we can have it as a diagnostic ramp. Now I can rename all these ramps, so it might be worth doing, but I mean, visually we can tell what they're doing. But I could say, this is our speed ramp. And this one here is our, well, it's our color ramp, but we could just call it our Nebula. Or, yeah, I was going to say noise ramp, but Nebula ramp is cool. It's very abstract nebula. It's not exactly a simulation here. Pretty cool though. Okay, so if I now plug distance directly into that, you might already be able to predict a problem that we're going to have. So let's change this to a diagnostic color. Heat. And then I solo that color. And let's play the render. You can see absolutely everything is red. And you can imagine there's a good reason for that. If you think that we need a color ramp needs a 0 to 1 value input, or something different depending on if you're trying to trick it into doing other things, but really 0 to 1 would give us a full range of blue to red, but we're seeing only red, so that means that all the values of these particles are above 1, so they've all moved more than 1 unit, which is not hard, is it? Because clearly they've moved quite a far distance. Now what I can also do, just to make this really clear in this view here, is I can actually scale our particles up. We don't need to resim or anything like that. Oh, I can actually turn off that color driver there. So I right click and I'm going to add a cycles instance tag, sci instance tag. And what this lets me do is this lets me control the particles after the simulation, and it's sort of what cycles will read in. So I could pump the size of these up huge, so 500%. And that's going to be useful just to be able to see this, say from the start here to the end, or vice versa. Okay, so now the problem that we've got is we need to remap, we need to change sort of range map the distance to 0 to 1. So we need to change 0 to 2400 into a 0 to 1 and squish that into that range. Now, you don't have to worry about too much about how to do that. I've got a bonus video on range mapping, and we create a group called range mapping. If I drag that into our node graph here, you can see it's actually this group with these inputs and outputs set up. And I'll let you, if you want to watch that video, that's no problem. If not, just load this group in and you can utilize that. But it is a very useful, I use this node pretty much in every single material. It's very useful, especially if you're bringing in data from outside, whether it be exposure or particle data, or hair even. So distance traveled, we're going to pipe this into the input value. So I'm going to put the input value there, then I'm going to plug the mapped value into there. Now, we won't see any change at all here because whilst our output minimum and maximum is 0 to 1, so basically whatever comes out of this mapped value here is basically mapped to 0 to 1. It can't be any different. So what we will do is we will actually change the input. So this is the input. So the distance traveled, we know, we've just worked out that it's roughly 2400 units. And when I pump that in, immediately you see that we get the full gradient. And this is a really, really powerful workflow for deciding or choosing where to blend in materials and that kind of stuff. So, and I could even add a minimum value here. So a minimum distance traveled. So if you look at the blue here, it should shift along. So this is basically, we're starting the gradient at once they've moved 800 and then by the end of the 2400. I mean, we could go even less, 2200, something like that. But I want it to be, I want the blend. So this is, remember, this is blending this color here, which is the speed one, and that only really becomes relevant towards the end, like there, that nice kind of cool green color. And then the nebula color, which is back here. Oops, I need to be on frame 1 when the particles have actually generated. There we go. So we need to blend these two together, and I want to do that around about here. And I want it to be quite a smooth transition. So I think I can have it as a gradient from right towards the end up to here. So let's flick that back down to 0, so it doesn't matter if it's moved 0 distance. There we go. And remember, we've got to think about this in reverse, because the data that's stored in the cache is distance traveled that way, whereas I know we're reversing the cache. So just, if you can wrap your head around that. If not, don't worry, follow along and we'll get there. So if I solo out our ramp again, and this time I don't want it to end here. I want it to end, well, a good 1,000 units beyond there. There we go. So you can see this red value here is everything beyond that point, and then the blue value is all the way down at this point. And we're going to blend the two like so. In fact, maybe we do need a bit more. Well, let's test this out. So I'm going to leave that at 0 to 1200. And then what I'm going to do is, instead of our diagnostic ramp, I'm going to shake that and disconnect it. We don't need that anymore, but I might leave it somewhere. Sometimes it's good to have those in this. Oh no, I'll tell you what, I'm going to delete that. That's probably a safer bet so we don't get confused later. What I want to do is I actually want to blend. I want to drive this mix shader. Oh yeah, we've already set that up. So I'm going to grab a ramp. And I'm just going to have it black and white. And then the color of that goes into that mix shader. Now, if a node graph is getting a little overcomplicated and we need to kind of route our paths a little bit more cleanly, we can actually do something. If you hit Control and Alt or Control Option and you drag, you'll get this, what looks like a kind of a cut line. But if you're holding Control and Alt, it'll actually add something called a pivot. What this lets you do is it just lets you relocate the wires a little bit, and also allows you to use that as an input elsewhere. But I don't think we actually need that right now, but if you're getting a lot of crisscrossing of wires over stuff, it's kind of useful. I'm fine without that for now though, that's cool. Okay, so we've got this ramp, and what I could do is I could put it on the same level as those, and then that's going to sit nicely there. So we've got our range mapper into our color ramp, and what I wanted to do is to blend those two colors. So, and that's doing exactly that. So if I solo this, our black and white gradient should be black here and then white there. Bit counterintuitive because it's obviously it's flip reversed. You've got to think of all of this inverted in your head because we're doing it the other way around. But let's, I could make this quite a sharp gradient actually. There we go. Now, depending on which one we've got connected into which port, if I solo this, yeah, we've got it correctly around. If I had it the other way around, you can just do that. You can just drag them from one to the other, and you can see it's flipping between one shader and the other. Awesome. So this is working really nicely. I'm pretty happy with this. Pretty much all I'm doing here is I'm making it a little bit of a sharper change. And let's jump into the camera view, otherwise we won't really get a good feel for this. So main shot cam. Just nudge it on a bit. Let's get it to update. There we go. Oh, now our particles are huge, so we could drop those back down to 100%. There we go. And in fact, if we unsolo that, we'll get the additive mode back. There we go. Nice bit of brightness. So at the very beginning, I want this nebula to be colored, kind of these multicolors, just gentle multicolors. There we go. Nice. Moving along. And then they blend into this kind of warmer looking color. And in fact, I think at the very end, we're actually going to transition it into a totally different material. We'll actually transition it into the gold material. Similar to the trails, and we'll have some kind of twinkling light in the actual shape itself. So to do that, now we've pretty much got all the information that we need to do that kind of thing. We can actually just use the same distance calculation and ramp it slightly differently. So let's I'll show you what I mean. So let's connect that up there. So we're mixing those two there. Let's keep this a bit organized. There we go. So I need another mix shader. Now I could just select this one, hold Control, and drag it over here. That's because I'm lazy. I can't be bothered to go and look at it on the other side there. So copy and paste is all the way. I'm going to do the same for this color ramp here, and I'm going to connect it to the same range mapping group. Bring that range map over here just to kind of make it a bit more tidy. And then I'm going to connect this ramp up to the factor. And then this material below here, well, it's going to be essentially our gold material that we've already created. So if it's exactly the same color, which I think it is, when we were sort of developing it, let's have a look. Might be a bit higher saturated, but let's grab this. Well, in fact, let's just add a principled node, and we can add this color in. So let me go back to our X-Particles. Now I'm going to call this Psi XP, or actually let's call it Nebula Particles. There we go. So it's nebula or nebulous weird energy particles forming into these gold particles. Kind of a bit elemental. I like it. So principled is over here. So we add a principled Bsdf, and all a principled is as we saw. Oops, didn't mean to connect that. You can shake to disconnect. Remember. All this is it's kind of like a universal. It was developed by Disney, but it allows you to generate or create materials based on some sort of pretty basic parameters, but you can get incredibly complex setups just from this one node. So, you know, some setups require all these nodes and all this kind of stuff, but actually you can get by sort of a lot of real world materials via this node. So we've got the principled node. We want to mix that into our items here. And have I got something soloed? Let's double check. Nope, but I do think I need to invert my gradient. Let's just move the gradient back. Yes, I think it's the other way around. So invert the gradient. And there you go. You can start to see that this is the material that we're getting. If I clamp that down somewhere like here. Oh no, actually, let's do... No, I did have it the right way around. I just need to clamp it a bit further up that way. Oh, I know what I've done. Yeah, these are in the wrong ports. So this is where I could just flip these ports over. Now I can invert this gradient. So invert the gradient and it'll give me that. And then if I put the white on that side, oh no, it won't. No, I think I do absolutely need to have the black gradient there, something like this. So this is what we had earlier. And then if I just make sure that we can see this, let's give this a really obvious color for now. A horrendous color. There we go. That's definitely horrendous. And let's swap where they should be. So all we need to do is just swap those two ports over. And there we go. Now, if you want to, sometimes I get a bit I want to have them in the right order, but sometimes that's not practical, but that you could do that and just collapse the principled node. But I'm quite happy to have it below here for now. Okay, so that's probably blending a little too late. Let's kind of soften it a little bit. I don't want it to be too sharp. I don't want it to suddenly change, so there we go, a bit smoother. And obviously this is a horrendous color at the moment. We don't want that. So let's set it up to that kind of the warm. It was a sort of a warm bronzy kind of color. So I think I remember some of the 36, 37, something like that. That's quite warm. That's probably too saturated as well. So drop it right down, probably at 2/3-ish, and then like so. Okay, but now that if we actually zoom into this, if we jump into a default camera, zoom right into it, zoom right in, you can see these spheres or these particles are actually sort of diffuse. And what I want is I want them to kind of twinkle like shards of sort of gold material. So I'm going to increase the metallic on them, and you can see we get that nice metallic look. But also I'm going to drop the roughness right down. In fact, I'm going to drop it to 0 for now. And zoom out a little bit. Now that's kind of working, but I'm finding that it's definitely too, what's the word here? It's too sort of round, too smooth. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my words out there. But essentially, we need it to be more sort of shard-like. So I could actually add some different kind of shapes into this tag. So I could put different objects in this tag with all sorts of different shapes, but I think that's overcomplicating things. So what we'll do is we'll just drop the sphere segments down. And if you look at one of these particles, now this is going to be tricky. Let's zoom into one. And let's jump to the tag again. Now, I can do all sorts of things here. I can do the scale. I can do the sphere segments, which is what we were looking at. If I drop it right down, you'll start to see it becomes sort of more jagged. So the lower I go, I mean, if you go too low, you'll end up with just a sort of a... That's quite interesting, just tetrahedral. Okay, maybe 5. 4 or 5, there we go. I think 4 is probably the lowest it can go before it changes to another shape. So 5 is fine. And then you can see they're oriented in all the same way. Now, we don't have to recache and set the rotation in the emitter or anything. We can actually just do 100% rotation variation on every axis, but we have to actually give it some rotation offset to randomize. There we go. And then we could play with different seeds. We could change that, and it would be, you know, different seeds. There we go. So let's zoom out. Now, in fact, we can actually see the color blending there, by the way. I don't know if you saw it. The green was actually sort of displaying in that. There we go. We've got this orange color in there. If I go back further, hopefully it's going to blend back to our nebula. Yeah, there we go. Excellent. So this is all working as expected. And let's scrub towards the end, and let's just let it seal up a little bit. There we go. Excellent. So if I zoom in, just to some particles here, you can see that catching the light quite sharply, and I think this is where we're going to have to sort of orient the lights in a specific way. But you can see we could also drop the radius down if we wanted, all that kind of cool stuff. But I'm pretty happy with that. It kind of forms the logo. It's very readable. And there we go. So as long as you've got enough particles to coat it, you're going to get that kind of cool look. And we're going to add those supplementing features, such as the cool edges, and also obviously the trails are finished by this point. But also I think we're going to add some sort of twinkling using some sort of spline or some particles moving across the surface and that kind of thing. So we'll do that very last though. But for now, I think that's pretty much our particle setup done. Yeah, so let's just jump in the camera, just check it, sanity check it. That's looking cool. Just step forward a few frames at a time. It's always good to do sort of low res renders and tests for this kind of thing. There we go. And there's the transition. It's now all formed the gold that is forming our logo, or the bronze or whatever, maybe even copper. And there we go, forming our logo. Now there is definitely some things missing here. I feel like we definitely need some more sort of particles that we're flying through. So if you look at the end here, the end frame, we're actually missing some kind of atmospheric particles surrounding us. It's like it's too many of them were kind of sucked into the logo to create it. So what we can do is we can just add some sort of ambient particles, and we can just create an entirely new system for this. So in fact, let's just make sure that one is on. Okay. So let's actually add a new system, and we're going to call this our, what should we call this? Star field. And we'll call this, actually, in fact, we're going to have two kinds of star field, I think. So we'll have a static star field. And let's make that a yellowy color. And we're going to make these kind of huge sort of zones that we can kind of animate through. So in the emitter itself, let's change it to a big, let's just make a box size. That's huge. Okay, and then let's increase the size. So let's try 5,000 by 5,000. If I look at the top view, we get a good idea of how big that actually is. Much bigger than our logo, that's for sure. And we're going to have two of them. We'll have one which is like a large scale and one sort of a smaller scale, and we kind of mix them together a bit. So let's say Starfield large. And let's actually jump to the emission tab. In fact, whilst we're developing this, I'll turn off cycles and we'll jump back to my startup layout. And let's have a quick look at our emission tab. And we're going to make these much smaller. And also we're going to make it a shot emission. They're not going to move anywhere. They're going to be static. So they're just going to be a shot of particles. Doesn't even need to be that many. I mean, 10,000, 15, 12, there we go. And let's press play. And you can see it generates a bunch of particles. Now, if you notice, our particles are actually getting sucked into the center based on modifiers not in the... It's actually the cover modifier, because I can tell it's doing it by the fall off. So we want to make sure this is completely isolated from the rest of the scene, remember? So we need to check on only modifiers in the same scene and only deformers in the same scene. I'm going to turn off the icon in the viewport just because I prefer that off. I'm going to hit play, and then our particles start to move, because if we jump to our emitter, they actually have a speed. Drop that to 0 and boom, we have a static star field. So if I jump back hitting F1, you can see them. They're these green ones in the background here. If I actually, let's turn off the implosion for now. We'll get an idea. And now you can see we're moving through this star field, and it keeps things a bit more relative, a bit more alive. And we don't seem to be intersecting any of them, which is good. Now let's check what size they are. So let's change the display to circles. There we go. Oh, they're quite large at the moment. Let's make them quite small. They're kind of distant and are kind of dust, if you like. But we're at kind of a weird abstract scale here, so it's fine. So let's drop them down. Let's make the maximum size 1 and then down to pretty much 0. There we go. Much more respectable sizes. That's looking pretty cool, actually. And the way that we're going to have that, I think we're probably going to have the... Well, these might be the smaller ones, so the sort of background ones. So let's call that small. And we'll push them perhaps back in. Let's jump into our top view. Let's duplicate that for now, and let's call this one large. Now, where are the particles starting? Okay, so as long as the camera has enough coverage of them, so it starts within the field, that's all good. So we've got our large and our small. Let's give them some different colors just so we've got a bit of differentiation. I'm actually running out of a color palette, aren't I? So there we go, that's fine. So small and large. Now the large ones can be way more sparse, I think. So let's go back to that 1,000 particles. And that's the ones that we're going to flow through at the beginning. And then kind of we want this overlap, essentially. You can see this kind of 50-50 overlap. The camera never goes through the small star field, but it does go through the larger one. So if I go back to frame 0 and just bump that, and you can see this one is way sparser, but I'm going to make them much larger. So let's double the size. There we go. There we go. And you can see that gives us this real feel of moving through space, moving through a field. So having these kind of, and it goes for dust particles as well and all sorts of stuff like that. So If you need to feel a bit more like you're moving through a space, then I would recommend adding interstitial particles and that kind of stuff. It's excellent. Okay, so now we've got them in the scene. How are we going to render them? Well, we just need to add materials to them, of course. So we're going to keep this very simple. In fact, actually, we could set the color in the actual emitter itself. So if we go to Display tab, what we could do is we could just randomly assign them colors. Actually, no, let's do it in the material because that's easier. We're in the rendering section. Why not? Let's do it in the material. So let's create a new material and let's go cycles, and we're going to add one of the presets because we might as well. So it's additive color. Remember, we were doing this in our Nebula material. Just going to move that. Let's call this plain light, and then this one is going to be called Starfield. Starfield. There we go. Oh, I should say static, shouldn't I? There we go. And if I jump into it, in fact, let's jump back to our cycles layout. So we're back in here. If I hit play, we're not actually going to see any new stuff because I haven't added any tags to this Starfield yet. So let's bring it down next to our implosion so that we can kind of share some of the stuff. Let's collapse some of these, get a bit more organized. And let's just chuck that tag onto there and that tag onto there. In fact, actually, I should probably be a bit careful with that because that had all those preset rotations and stuff in them. When I don't really need any rotation stuff in this one. So I'm just going to add new instance tags to those. And I should just add this material to both of them. There we go. Now, currently, it's just transferring the material, which is just the green color of the particles, into our scene. If I exaggerate the size of our particles enormously, you'll actually get a better view of them. And if I go into here, what I want to do is I actually want to take a randomization of these particles instead of, so if I unhide this, in the particle info node, I showed you earlier, we have this random option here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that random option and I'm going to ramp it with a totally different color. So let's connect that up to our emission and unsolo, and now you can see it's overridden our particle color and it's just assigning random 0 to 1 values. But it's still additive. You can see those grays are blending with particles behind them and so on. Not particularly necessary because they're so sparse, but it'll work. So now we want to add a ramp. This is a very common workflow, as you can tell. It's my favorite workflow in here because it's easy to understand, I think. And let's load a preset in. Let's, at the advice of Mario, here we go. So the Flame 4 preset is one we were using. And you can see here, now if I look at the viewport here, we can see the colors assigned. Yeah, that's all good. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the scale right back down. And we might even be able to go smaller. Can you see that one's a little visible? Like it's a little bit obviously a floating sort of star there. So we might want to just drop that down a touch. Yeah, just break that down a little bit just so we can't see it that well. And if we turn the small one off, we'll just see the density. Yep. So it's going to be pretty subtle. And we don't want it to overpower the main simulation, so that's good. But it's definitely there once we've finished. And then if the Starfield is in the background there, that one too could probably drop down, just so it's really, really subtle. There we go. And let's scrub back to the beginning. The very beginning, actually. One frame in. There we go. And yeah, we can see our Starfield. It's quite subtle at the moment because obviously we've got so much stuff overriding. We've got some big ones here. We're a bit closer to the camera. But as soon as the camera moves through that field, it's going to look cool. If I pause that and just press play, you can see now we've got context. We've got different levels of parallaxing because they're at different scales. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hide the emitter display. So with this big grid, this big box that's coming over here, we can actually hide that. If we go to the display tab, we can just turn off draw emitter. And it's not going to turn off the particles, but it is going to turn off the emitter itself. We could even hide that horizon in the viewport as well whilst we're at it. There we go. Awesome. So we're moving through the space. We've got these particles, but I do want to add this size variation to the nebula. So at the moment, it's all one kind of specific size, and we don't have these kind of bigger stars being involved in that sim. So what we can do is we could actually create a couple more emitters, and we just cache them. We reduce the number of them just dramatically, and we also have them at a much larger size, and we have them sort of, well, the size doesn't matter too much because we can change that in post, but we have them behave exactly like the main implosion. So let's it's going to all be based off that main implosion shape and stuff. So we might as well just copy that, give it some different seed values, and exclude some modifiers so that it doesn't stamp color or inherit color where we don't want it to. So I'm actually going to duplicate the main implosion. I'm going to delete the cache tag for now because I don't want that on there. And we unhide it. And we rename this. This is going to be called Implosion Stars. So probably going to have two of these, and they're probably going to have different scales similar to the star field itself. Just give the emitter a different color. We could even add a subfolder because we're going to add a few of these. So just call them stars in the context of this system. That'll make sense. So drop the stars in there. And then we just need to make sure several of our modifiers are active. Now, really, I think we only want this to be sort of attracted in by the everything else. So it's going to be another a cache reversal. So let's hide our main implosion. Let's go back to startup. So we've got a nice big viewport to work with. Let's go to an editor camera. Turn our starfield system off for now as well. And we're just going to work with these stars here. So currently they're set to quite a high sort of count value. So we've got absolutely loads of particles being emitted from this this stars sort of option here. So let's drop it right down. Let's do 10,000. Let's make them, well, they already are small, so that's fine. And like I said, we can actually apply pretty much all of our size stuff down on that, on the at render time. So it's like a really handy workflow. Okay, so we've got this set of particles. Let's see if they're actually active yet. Oh, they're hidden at the moment, so that will not help. There we go. So away they go. Wrong way, of course, because they're not cached yet, and reversed. And it looks like they scooch off all the way down the timeline. Now, I'm guessing that's probably because our questions and action setup isn't triggering yet, or it's turned off. So let's double check that. Yes. So you can see here our questions and actions are turned off. And I want it to exclude inherit and color. Not that it really matters. I think we're going to be assigning them color in post anyway. But let's just go to our modifiers, exclude color and inherit, just to make sure. We can actually go to the display tab and we can assign our random colors here if we like. So what we could do is go gradient random, and then I'm going to use exactly the same gradient that we just used. I think it was the flame 4. There we go. Press play. And away they come. Very cool. Obviously reversing, we could turn that streams off as well for now. And there you go, they freeze as well. Let's double check they're in the kind of correct positions relative to everything else. That's looking pretty good. Let's go back to the... Oh, not that one. Default. There we go. Just look down at here. That's cool. I think the only way we're really going to tell is with a cache. But let's tell you what we could do. So if we turn the main implosion on, so that we actually get that, and if the playback is currently reversed, if you recall. So if I actually temporarily reset this to normal, no offset and reset there, that's now going the correct direction and they're in the relative positions. So if you look at that, that is exactly where it should be. And we haven't given this emitter a different seed. We probably should have done, but actually it's not going to really matter in this scenario because the star particles will be larger and it's all additive anyway, so they'll add on to each other. So okay, we've got these implosion stars. These are probably going to be our small ones because they're quite dense at the moment. So if I turn that off, look. Oh, let's reset our cache actually. Let's undo those few steps. Oh, I've gone too far. Oh, hang on. Undo, 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 undo. There we go. Okay, back to where we were. We turn the main implosion off again. And here's our new stars. And what we just need to do with those is we need to cache those in. What I can do is I can create another cache for those. So I create a new cache. We just call this one stars. And as long as there's no clash with the naming, so that they're unique names, there's going to be no problem doing this. So I'm going to include. I'm going to only include this stars one. Now we've got one size. If I jump to our cycles render and jump to our camera view or our main shot camera, and in fact, if I actually stop the animation of our camera, so if I unlock it, go back to this point, if I actually just deactivate this animation here, it won't animate anymore. So when I press play, there we go. Just so that we can see these at their kind of final position out here. And I should actually turn on those other particles just whilst we're developing the look here. So jump back into the cache. Object, remember it's an offset of 57 just so we can flip it back later. And the scale of 100. And that should load in. There we go. Just have to nudge that frame to get it to load there. And what we'll do is we will set the render going. And currently we can't see anything because these aren't luminous at the moment. They're probably behaving very strangely because they're utilizing this very complex nebula particle graph, but we actually don't need it. We just need the star field one pretty much. And I think it'll be slightly more unique because we're going to pull... Well, actually, I don't think we need to. We could just use exactly the same material. So throw that on there. And can we see them? No, we can't. Oh yeah, we need to give them a unique tag as well. Cycles instance tag. And I'm not seeing anything at the moment, so let's just check. If I solo this out... Oh, the strength is quite low on that star field, actually. Yeah, that's a good point. Got it at 0.5, when I think it should really be pumped a little bit higher than that. So, let's try 1.5. Let's put our star fields on. Let's replay the timeline. Oh, what's struggling? I think it's probably loading into cycles. There we go. Okay, I could scrub this, probably get away with that because some of it's cached. Oh no, I can't, can I? Because it's the... I can, whilst it's playing, I can turn off the main implosion if that helps speed. It does. There we go. Let it get out to here and have it settle a little bit. Decelerates, which will become an acceleration in a minute. Kind of spreads out like that. It's kind of cool. Turn the main implosion. Actually, let's leave the main implosion off right now whilst we develop this look. And there we go. There's our randomly assigned particles. And here are here's our randomly assigned color. Now, if I solo the color, it'll be the exact colors they are in the viewport here. But they are quite dark, and they are quite So definitely want it to be additive, because otherwise we wouldn't have enough strength basically to see them. That's definitely looks like enough strength value. If I pump it right up, you'll see it just bleaches out to nothing. So 1 1/3 instead. And let's turn the main implosion on and just see if we can see them. Oh yeah, we can. Okay. Okay, they're looking pretty cool. I think these are going to be our smaller stars, perhaps, because there's quite a few of them. But let's give them some size variation. There we go. Starting to see them a bit better now. If I just turn off that, there we go. Now we're seeing them. So I have to. We're kind of doubling the size of them a little bit here, so because of the variation, but that's all good. We don't need them to be quite as high res either, so I could just drop the sphere segments down, and we're going to duplicate this. So let's duplicate this one. I'm going to call those stars small, and this one's going to be called stars large. In fact, I'm just going to get rid of the implosion part of it, just so it's nice and short compared. There we go. So the large ones, it's going to be exactly the same sort of emission mechanism, but this time we're going to have them emit way less, or way fewer, I should say. So let's go slightly bigger radius. Like I said, that doesn't particularly matter actually, but let's just do that anyway. Let's hit play. I'm going to pause whilst this is simulating. Just let it run up the timeline until they kind of settle towards the end. And then this is actually probably one of the last things we'll create for the render, and we'll be pretty much ready to go. So there we go, settling out, that's fine. We'll work on this frame. Hit play. Okay, we've got the large ones here and the small ones here. And now we can clearly see I am going to have to scale those up quite dramatically. Let's see what they look like. They're looking quite large here, but are they... I think we're probably going to need to scale them down as we get close in. Do you remember we did the same with the trails? So what I'm going to do is, because they're quite large on this surface here, so if we jump to our... Not that one, keep doing that. Zoom in. Yeah, so you can see we've got our large particles and our small particles. There we go. I think these could be way larger. And we could just use the variation to... Can you see that? We can kind of have the full gamut of small to large sizes there. And they're way too big, obviously, when they're on there. So we can just scale it, multiply it down using this. But I quite like them to be large at the very beginning. Or sort of, well, the beginning of the shot. So not here, but once they're formed. So what we do is we'll probably animate these. So... I mean, that's the full variation. Let's keyframe this. So let's have a keyframe. Where do we want them to start scaling back up again? So where did we do the... we scaled the trailed object down, if you recall. Let me just check what frames they were. I think it was 200. Okay, 240-ish. I'll tell you what, let's wing it a bit. Let's start the scaling down around about 200. Remember, this is all in reverse, so this is the final size. And then what we want is probably another 50 odd frames. Actually, do I want them? Well, remember, this is going to be cached, so I shouldn't really do this yet. So let's just leave them at 100% right now. Let's do the caching, and then we'll come back and do any kind of scale stuff. I should be a bit careful of that. So that's all looking good, though. So let's just jump into our startup view. And let's just cache these particles out. This will be pretty fast. So jump down here. Let's close our star field off. We could cache the star field if we wanted, but I don't think it's necessary. So we need to include that new one, the large one. Double check them, 1200 particles. Yep, fewer of those. Just check that it's moving off before caching. In fact, actually there is a way we can cache this, which will actually allow us to see a playback as well. So if we click on this cache, we can change this mode from sync mode to playback mode. Now the only caveat to that is that we need to make sure that we are playing every single frame. So if you look here, we've got this all frames and the project, and it means that it's not going to skip to keep up the frame rate in the viewport. It will process every frame before it moves on. And if I hit play now, this is actually generating a cache. You can see each frame has, exactly 11,200 particles, because obviously we've done that as a shot emission. And it's caching it down to disk. And it's all working nicely. It's very lightweight disk, sort of cache here. A couple hundred megs, no problems. There we go, and run it all the way to the frame 500. Now, when it loops back round the other time, it will see that there are cached frames, and it should be able to just play them back. So, now I press play. Now they're cached. Now it's reading from the cache. So to secure that as a cache, I'm just going to change it back to sync mode, just so that it's all working nicely. And now I can scrub, and we have our stars added as well. So this is where we can start to develop that look that I was trying to work on. And if you recall, I do need to switch back our cache offset was 57 frames with a negative of 100. I need to do exactly the same in this one. Playback, make sure hold is set. Positive 57 offset with a negative there. And you're starting to see we're getting a nice mix of textures and sizes of our particles in the view. So there we go. Oh, look at that. That's looking much nicer. All right. So we've got our huge variation here. Let's do that animation down that I was kind of talking about. So we should turn our camera animation back on as well. Can you see how large these particles are here at the end? They're going to probably look a bit silly. Let's jump. Yeah. That was my concern there. So on they go. And on they go to the logo, and they look like these kind of slightly too large orbs. So what we'll do is we'll scale it down. We'll probably scale it down to around about 330 frames or 350, something like that. Let's set exactly the size that we want it at the very end. So 20. In testing, we had this at sort of about there. Then I jump back to around about the 200th frame. In fact, let's just do 200. And that was about 85. So there we go. So they're nice and visible here, but then they scale down gradually as we step forward through the frames. Just let them resolve a little bit. When you're using a path tracer to view particles, you just want it to resolve a little bit, because you can't tell at some point what is the resolving noise and what is the particle. So just give it a second. I mean, this is quite a simple scene actually, all in all, for the render engine anyway. But just give it a second, and I'm getting a good feel from that. Excellent. Great. Okay, so we've added our secondary particles, our secondary kind of shaped size particles for a bit of texture. That looks really nice. And the last thing I want to do is I want to add, well, actually it's going to be a separate pass entirely. But let's turn everything back on actually. Let's put the trails back on and get a good feel for our final look. Got our star field on in the background there, that's good. Yeah, they've benefited from that boost in light as well, actually, so we can see them nice and clearly. And let's turn on the streams. There we go. So let's scrub a little bit. We might need to relight that. In fact, yeah, let's do the rotating light on the logo here. So we're not so much worried about the particles here. Let's turn all of those off. It's really it's to have that highlight here move around our object. So we want to start it off a little bit kind of rotated around, sort of, well, let's go back to the, well, let's jump into a different view actually. Camera perspective in the second view here. And we can see our rotating light shapes here. We're in a display view, which is NF. Let's change it to NA. There we go. These are our rotating lights. Now they're a little bit close in perhaps, but that's fine. I think we'll just have them like that for now. And if we start them vertical, so let's start them, I think they can just be rotating the whole timeline, by the way. So that's 0. Start them at 0 here. That's fine. This is like their beginning position. Something like that. I might want to make them a bit. Well, let's see. Let's see what happens first. And let's scrub all the way to the end of the timeline. And then I guess we want to do 1 or 2 turns. So maybe start it off. Let's try. Let's try a full turn. So it's going clockwise. It's following our. Oh, we might want to go counter actually. Let's see. Okay, this might not be particularly evident. What we could do is we could press play and we could throw a few of these clips or you know, do a test render here. We've prototyped this quite a bit, so I'm pretty confident that this will work. But yeah, so it's clockwise rotation. Might want to bring one of those a little bit forward like that. Yeah, that's looking cool. All right. So let's jump into the main shot camera. There we go. And remember to hide these from the actual display, the render. And there we go. We're having the reveal form. Let's turn on our other elements again. And I think that's pretty much it for the particles and the streams. Let's just check a few frames here. That's looking cool. Excellent. And there we go. We've got this nebula at the very beginning here. Nice and spaced out. There we go. Punch through a few frames. So at the end, once the logo has actually formed, there's a sort of a bit of an element here that we want to add, and that's this sort of glistening. So currently they are quite sort of sparkly particles, but we can actually take this further. So if I pause this and I go to startup, what I'm going to do is you could either do this in a totally new file, that's not a problem, or we could create this using a take or some like a way to do it like that. So let's do that now. Let's create a new take, and we jump to the takes tab over here, and we make this a new child take. And what we should do really is create one for our final render and one for our sort of pass render, if you like. But to be honest, let's keep it simple. Let's keep it as a main take and the new take. And the new take is going to be called glimmering. And it's basically the shimmer or glimmer of the gold on here. And we're just going to create a pass for this. And we're using particles to do that. So let's first of all, let's put the takes into auto take mode. Now be careful with this. Once it's in this mode, anything you do in your scene will be stored in the take override over here. So what we want to do is we want to open these up, and we want to turn off any of the particle stuff that we don't want. In fact, it's pretty much everything here. So we could use layers for this, but this is fine. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to turn in everything I don't want on right now, and nothing more. There we go, turn off those, everything's off, and our implosion geometry is hidden anyway, that's fine. So now you'll see we get this objects over here when we go back to the takes, and you can see in this take, all of that stuff has been turned off. So these are our primary things that are being rendered for our main beauty, which is in main. So if we go back to main, and you'll see it's all activated. If I go back to glimmering, it's all deactivated. So that's all good. Now, one thing we've got is we've got some other items in the scene. So we want to hide them. So if I go back to my takes, we've got our auto takes active. And we could always bring this takes manager out by undocking it, by the way. So you could go undock, and you could just have it floating here if you like, or you could dock it somewhere else. I like to be able to see it at the same time as my OM, so I tend to dock it just in there. And then I collapse it and expand it depending on... So if I hold control there, I can just click that corner there and it'll just collapse it. Okay, anyway, that's superfluous stuff. And this has gone long already, so let's just get this done. And so we've got the glimmering thing. The last thing I want to do is just hide anything else that we don't need. So it's that. And that is pretty much it. So let's turn off our... Well, we'll leave our lock overrides on. And we will now go back to our scene. And let's add an emitter. Let's emit particles from this geometry. Sorry, not this geometry. So that's the XP logo. This is the implosion geometry. So emit from object. There we go. And we can put this in its own system as well, just to keep it organized. So let's create a new system. And this one is going to be called glimmering. And we can get rid of that emitter. We don't need that one. Let's put this in there. Let's drop that there. And we can color this whatever we like. Well, let's turn lock overrides off. It locks some of these objects, so we don't need that on anymore. Oh, we've already got yellow taken. Where are we going for colors? Let's go for a blue. There we go. Just so it's something distinct. Could do the same for the emitter as well. Just helps us identify stuff in the object manager, of course. Now that's obviously a long name. Let's just call it emitter glimmering. It gives it the name of whatever you emit from. So obviously that's a bit of a long name already. So XP emitter glimmering. Now if I press play. Oh, first things first actually. Let's make sure it's not cross-pollinating modifiers. So turn only modifiers in the same scene. Turn the icon off. Let's jump to a default camera. Not that one. Keep doing that. There we go. We zoom in here. And let's display our particles as circles. Let's do filled circles. There we go. So we're emitting particles off of this mesh, but obviously we don't want them to go anywhere. We want this to look like it's glimmering light. So we need these to stay static on the mesh. So first of all, let's kill the speed. And then of course we can't have them lasting forever and ever and ever. So what we'll do is we will, well, first of all, let's drop the birth rate right down. Something like that. Maybe even less than that, actually. And then they can't exist forever. So we're going to have them exist for a specific number of frames. Oh, there we go. I might give them a bit of variation. So let's do... Actually, let's do 35 with a variation of 5. There we go. And now what we'll do is we'll scale these up and down over their lifespan. And we can do that with a scale modifier. So this is sort of stuff that we've covered in different ways across this project. So hopefully this is somewhat familiar now. And what we're going to do is instead of having it scale up like using these values, we're actually going to have it just set the particle radius. We're just going to have it force the particle radius to a specific size. So let's say, well, 1.5 maybe, depending on how large that looks. This is like the maximum size. Let's notch that up a bit. So they're nice and visible. There we go. We can make these pure white. Like so. That's looking cool. And now we need the scale modifier to scale them up. So because we've set that to that, we can't just animate that up and down. It's just going to animate them all at the same time. So what we want it to do is we want it to utilize the data from the particles, the lifespan of the particle. So if I add this map and I go lifespan, then I'm actually going to drop this curve right down to the bottom, but I'm going to add a new knot in the center here, or a new point. Put it, well, let's have it go to the full value. And let's, the parameter it's driving currently is scale change, which actually isn't even exposed here at the moment. We need to drive the radius value. So let's go back to our mapping tab. We are driving our radius value. over lifespan, and you can see there you go. And you can see we get this nice twinkling effect. Excellent. So I actually want to render the geometry in this particular take because I want it to occlude the particles. I don't want to be able to see the particles behind. I just want this to be a surface effect. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to actually turn our our lock overrides and our auto take back on. Jump to our implosion geometry, and I'm going to show it. I'm going to make sure it's displaying in the render. I'm then going to turn all that stuff off because we don't want that on now. And I'm going to add a tag to this. So I'm going to right click, tag, compositing, because we're actually going to use standard render for this render pass, just to show you that you can mix and match. And there's nothing wrong with using standard for all of this. Cycles is obviously very powerful for photoreal and stuff, but when you're doing utility passes like this, there's no reason not to jump to the standard. You could absolutely create this in Cycles, just to say, but for now, why not? Let's use this. So the implosion emission geometry, let's make it a matte object. This just means it'll render pure black in the viewport. And we need to create a render setting for this particular take. So let's open this up. Yeah, we haven't actually done any Cycles stuff, so I'm going to create one of those in a minute. But for now, I'm actually going to create a child render setting of this one. So if we change the range of this project ever, it'll always respect this particular child object here. So what we want to do is we want to go 0. I mean, it's going to be 0 to 500 either way. So 0 to 500. Oops, I should undo that on this one. If you want to undo that, you can just select the ones that are in bold, right click them, and you go inherit parent setting, and you see it jumps to the... So if I change that one, it now changes the child one as well. So that's quite useful. So we'll call this one glimmering, and we will make it active on this particular take. So glimmering there. When we go back up to main, let's make sure it's on the default. That's fine. So 4D beauty. There we go. And we'll tweak those Cycles 4D settings in a minute. We're going to need to override a couple of things. So if we add Cycles to the top render setting, it'll automatically add a Cycles post effect, which is what we need obviously to generate the Cycles 4D stuff, but it also adds it to the child. So what we do is we change it back to standard in the child, and this is now the part that's being overridden. If you jump back and forth, you can see that now that's been removed. And then we'd just let this inherit all the other settings. We'd give it some anti-aliasing, probably don't even need that much anti-aliasing, so not a problem. Let's just jump back to our glimmering. And if we render the viewport, we actually see nothing because our particles don't have a material on them. So what we'll do is we'll create a shader, X-Particles material, and this is a standard render or advanced render, C4D's standard render, X-Particles material. We just have to drag that onto there. And when I added that, it will automatically have added a post effect called X-Particles. If that's not in there, it won't be able to render the particles. So if I render that, you'll see we get these white particles. And they are going to glimmer, which is great. So if I just hid this geometry for a second, you're going to get an idea of what that glimmering effect is going to look like. Okay. So now all we need to do is go back into here, maybe tune those cycle settings just for a second, and then we'll call this project done, ready to render, and then we'll just quickly composite it in a second video, or in the last video, just to get things going. Okay, so at the moment, I think that's pretty good. That's looking pretty good in terms of settings. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the render settings for this. Oh, I'm on the wrong... just make sure we are assigned to the Cycles beauty. And glimmering is assigned to that one. Yes, it is. That's great. Okay, so it's loading back in here. And you can see here, we've got this, our Cycles pass here. And we're going to change it to CUDA. Just going to do some kind of basic stuff. This is all sort of the basics of Cycles where you go in and tweak render settings. Obviously, you want to increase your samples. So maybe up to 32, something like that. Now, something we do a lot in Cycles is we actually kind of clamp the settings for the rendering itself. So like maybe we're getting sort of sort of fireflies, that kind of thing. But in a scene that has floating particles and no diffuse shaders, there's no point in using any of the clamping or any of that. So this is actually a very simple scene to render. In fact, we could probably lower the particle count, the sample count. And we might want to increase the ray bounces. So if we jump into another camera, default camera, zoom right into here, go to the end where we've got loads of particles on here. I've gone past it a bit there. There we go. What we can do is we can actually have these sort of reflect a little bit more. Currently they are probably only doing one bounce. But if I increase this max ray bounce, you're actually going to get more bounces of light, more ray bounces, and it might actually fill that shape out a bit better. But that's pretty much it. I mean, we don't need to do anything particularly complicated here. We don't need to do anything with the curves. They're looking good. We could subdivide them a bit more, but I don't think they need it. So let's jump back into our camera. Just do a final sanity check. Just go through a few frames. That's looking really nice. And we have our trails coming in, our streams. There we go. Updating nicely in the RTP, real-time preview. And there we go, our final form. Brilliant. Okay, so now we're going to render this out. I'm going to change the settings a little bit. I'm probably going to go to full HD, just check everything's okay and save it to disk. And then we'll bring it into After Effects and give it its final compositing pass. Okay, this has been a long one, I know. Lots of different information about rendering and materials and that kind of thing. And we'll see you in the next one for compositing.